the top front A. Now, the next piece that you're going to sew together is this top front B. This was that kind of weird piece that we cut on the fold, part of it on the fold, and we kind of cut it off in that at an angle. So what you do is you are going to put the two angle pieces together, and then you're just going to go ahead and make your seam right in there. Now I finished mine with a serge, and that's not really a traditional. If you're really going for traditional, you can use a French seam instead of finishing the edges of your seam. And that's where you sew the wrong sides together with a scant 1/4 inch, and then you turn them, fold them back on themselves, and then put your seam in. And that encases the edge of the fabric. And I'll put a little video on sometime about how to do a French seam. But you can do those instead if you're really kind of going for the historical reenactment things. This is for the theater, so we're not really concerned about that, and we'll just serge off the edges. So I went ahead and put this in, and then you just go ahead and run it right off the edge of the fabric right there. Now, when you get down here, it's just like putting in a dart. Instead of back stitching, when you're done, you want to just go ahead and run off the edge of the fabric. Let me fold it this way, it might be a little easier to tell. Okay, so it's just like a dart. So instead of back stitching, when you get to this point, you're just going to run off the edge of the fabric, and you're going to take your tails and you're going to tie them into a box knot, or whatever they're called, where you loop one through and tie, and then loop the other one through and tie, and leave a knot there, and then just trim off your threads so they're not super long. You don't want to back stitch there, because what it'll do is it'll leave a little pucker, poofy thing, and you know, it's not very pretty. So that's what we're going to do there. And then also on this piece, what I did is it had you mark the boning lines 1, 2, and 3 on the right side of the fabric, and then the bones for 4 are marked on the back. Now you kind of have to measure these in when you're doing it off the pattern, because they don't show this edge right here. But I think, yeah, I think they were 3/4 of an inch rectangle. So you can just like mark each side and then draw in your rectangle with the straight ruler. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put on the bias tape, and that's what we're using to run the boning through for the boning channels. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, I'm just going to use the same broadcloth that I'm using, and I'm going to make boning channels out of that. And that crossed my mind too, and I thought, okay, I'll just buy extra fabric and it'll be just so much easier, because I can just strip it and do it while I'm, you know, doing the skirt. But really, when I went back and looked at it, I decided to go ahead and use the bias tape, because 1, it doesn't unravel at the edges like regular fabric does, and 2, it was a lot sturdier and a lot heavier than my broadcloth, because it has to hold a lot of pressure from those bones. They're, you know, just like big springs. So I decided to go ahead and use bias tape. Now, we didn't have any white bias tape, so I'm going to end up using black, which seems a little weird, but it's an hour and a half to the nearest fabric store, and I just really want to get this done today. So I am going to use black. And, you know, for us it doesn't matter. It doesn't show under any of our skirts because we put petticoats over them anyway. So, now on this pattern, you'll notice that this first boning channel comes to a V. Now that's absolutely impossible for a bone to do. We cannot do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of fudge this first channel in a little bit. And it's just something that when you're working with private company patterns, you know, kind of small company patterns, they don't always, especially the historical ones, do not always match up. They just don't. Like even in the picture for this one, the picture drawn on the pattern itself shows that this point comes to a point like this, not in a reverse V. And I looked at it like 10 times because I'm like, did I do that right? And I did. I did according to the pattern. So they are just drawn a little bit different on the instruction sheet. So don't freak out. With small pattern companies, you have to just trust your sewing skills and just trust that you're doing it the right way, and just make it work for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fudge this off a little bit. I'm going to probably take it down a little bit there, And then when I get around here, I'm going to try to maybe make a slight curve, but it cannot be a V and it cannot be a heavy curve, or it's not. There's no way you could get a bone through there. So we're just going to kind of fudge it across there, cut off that point, and slide these down a little bit like that. Okay? And then the other two, of course, because there's no seam, the other two came out perfectly fine. And when you kind of slide this up, you can see, whoa, focus, you can see that they're straight and there's no V. So they do have to curve like this. So we're going to go ahead and just put those in normal. Okay, I'm going to do those, and then we're going to talk about putting the bones on, or the boning channels on the back. Okay, here you can see that I have sewed on the boning channels for the front side. This is the right side. I used just about 1/8 of an inch sewed in from the edge because the boning channels are marked at 3/4 of an inch, and it calls for 1 inch bias tape, and actually bias tape comes, and this is actually 7/8 of an inch. So when you lay it over, remember that it's going to overlap your marks just a little bit. So I sewed in just a little bit. So when you get down to this bottom one, make sure you pay attention because this needs to be 1/2 inch at least up for your seam allowance. So kind of watch that. I got tied on one side, and then by the time I got to the other side I thought, I need to be a little bit farther up, so I scooted my channel up just a little bit. Also, you can just sew right across the edges like that, but you do need to leave a 3/4 inch gap on one of the seams so that you can put your bones in a little bit later. Okay, now on the back, we're going to sew in that kind of funny part right there. Now you're going to leave this top part open, and you're just going to sew down this edge, and then you're going to sew across the bottom like this at an angle, and then back up, and you're going to leave this top part open so you can put the bone in. Now when you come down here, make sure that you don't sew past where you've already sewn for that channel that's on the right side. So just be aware that that's there. In fact, I probably sew right at maybe the edge of where your channel is on the right side so that you're not crossing over it. I think it'll look a little bit neater. So I'm going to try to drop my stitching line right in there. You can kind of feel it with your fingernail where the crease is. Okay, and then also, and you do that too for this side too, down, across at an angle, and back up and leave this top part open. I think also I might even double sew that right there just so that it has, it's nice and tight, because I got a feeling it's going to get a lot of pressure right there because this bone goes up and through and back, so it's going to be pretty, quite a bit of pressure there. Also, they call for a 2-inch piece of bias tape, and then fold it in to make a square, and you'll sew it in like this so that the bone can come through this piece and back out. And then you're only going to sew it on the top and the bottom. And once again, this is on this first boning channel at the very top. Make sure that you don't cross into your other bone, and make sure that you leave these sides open, so just across the top and across the bottom. And I think I'm going to double sew that too, make sure that it's good and strong. Okay? Alright, we'll sew those, and then we'll come back and see what's next.